Welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
Yeah, I'm great. And I'm looking forward to this episode because the person we have on is somebody that I really respect in the field. Their research informs a lot of my research. And this is one of the people that I follow their work really closely, and I'm always really inspired by what they're working on and what they're saying. So, yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, so with no further ado, today we are lucky enough to be welcoming Dr. Adam Safron onto the show. Adam is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins Medicine. He is a meditation practitioner, and his work is focused on characterizing the nature of preferences and motivation from mechanistic, developmental, and evolutionary perspectives. Adam, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Really happy to be here with you too.
So, we are already using psychedelics in well being spaces and increasingly in research. Now, today we have a number of questions around this what we know, what we don't, where it's helpful, and where it isn't. But before we start, I wanted to ask you what is the current state of play when it comes to research today um, into using psychedelics to help well being?
Mm. Um, Hotly contested,
Yeah.
um, with a lot of, I believe, warranted enthusiasm and some, I believe, also some warranted caution.
Yeah, good. That's the whole playing field. So that's a good start, right? Big debate, lots to be hopeful for, some to
Mm.
be careful of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the state of play, I'd say. There's a lot of very promising new work coming out, some not so new, but ideas of linking psychedelic experiences to increased personality openness, increased psychological flexibility. There's a kind of mixed literature there in terms of part of the mixing is like, what do we mean by flexibility? Like if we're talking about like your ability to, let's say, pivot with relation to some framing of events to influence your emotional state, that's one kind of flexibility. But that might not be the same kind of flexibility as like switching tasks in some sort of like working memory, like figuring out a rule or something like that. So, but there is some evidence that psychedelics might help increase psychological flexibility, much more mixed on cognitive flexibility. And this might mediate some capacities to have positive long term change. Sometimes a radical change in terms of 1, 2 sessions, which people will report as being one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. They'll have a kind of mystical experience. What that means, I think we have some sense for, but it's still very much a mystery. Um, but and probably a mystery that would actually be well informed by deeper engagement with contemplative practitioners. But this idea, though, of a few sessions and you can turn around someone who's like stuck in a pattern and allow them to have adopt new patterns, that's almost unprecedented in like psychiatric practice. And so the question will be like, how robust are these results? How much, really making sure we're not dealing with selection effects or I would never want to say like just expectancy because our expectancy can be so powerful. But to what degree is it sensitive to the expectancy? That if you like try to deploy these interventions in other contexts, will they have the same like capacity to induce drastic change? Will the effects have the same staying power? We don't know, but there's I think there's many reasons though to think psychedelics are a game changer um, for practice, for people's ability to help themselves and others. But it's still it's only recent that we could really start to do the kinds of studies we need to do to have a reliable knowledge on this, I'd say.
So when you say psychological flexibility, the benefit there, right, is that lots of psychopathologies and lots of sort of suboptimal ways of living are about sort of being stuck, right? Sort of depression can be typified as a kind of stuck, emotional, cognitive space. And I guess addiction is like that as well. Like maybe everything has a little bit of that stickiness in it. And so your point is that psychedelics look like they have an impact on cognitive flexibility or psychological flexibility. Point there is that the reason why that supports well-being is because it can break up those sticky patterns. Is that right?
That would be the idea, and I think it's very much in the spirit of your work, and like also this kind of dynamic character to well-being, the ability to like move in and out of states and not get stuck in a single state, a
Right.
kind of like breathingness to it. Um, if you have a capacity for enhanced flexibility, that would be useful for a great many things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we know how that happens? Like, how do psychedelics do that? I mean, do we know yet like what the mechanistic sort of story is for what psychological flexibility looks like? Or I mean, what is that?
I would say no.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
That's okay.
we have some ideas. And so there's an account, no is a little too harsh, but that depends what you mean by no. Um, the uh, so at a mechanistic level, there's these ideas largely put forward by Robin Carhart Harris, which I find to be compelling in many respects.
Yeah.
One is that basically you are putting the brain into a state of increased entropy where you could have more combinatorics, more novel patterns that you might not otherwise have. So you break it out of its usual, somewhat more ordered state of business as usual, put it into a temporarily elevated, you could even maybe say elevated state of consciousness, maybe even technically speaking. And then under those conditions, people can explore new ways of being and then potentially bake them in with this period of elevated plasticity you see with psychedelics. Sometimes psychedelics are referred to as plastogens, and this is one model of their action. There's some really interesting data showing that you can open these plasticity windows. Gould Dolan at Hopkins is doing really excellent work there, where it seems like the intensity of the trip seems to correlate with the extent of opening these windows of juvenile-like plasticity in the brain, where whatever it was you were exploring, and continue to explore during this integration window and during this aftermath, you have an opportunity where the mechanisms are still unclear. It could involve things like loosening these matrices that sort of like keep the synapses, the connections between neurons bound in place, and actually letting those be a little bit more fluid, letting those like reconfigure a bit more. But it seems to be that you can get anywhere from a couple hours to potentially with something like ibogaine, a couple like maybe 2 months of an elevated plasticity window. And so that could be one way in which you could have greater flexibility. There's other stories to be told that are kind of in the spirit of entropic brain, like the relaxed beliefs under psychedelic model. And the idea is that basically psychedelics, particularly, I've been suggesting that the higher doses this might apply to, could potentially cause you to have some forms of synchrony that you would normally observe in the brain, which are thought to basically encode your beliefs. The idea of like basically brains have to form, or neurons have to form these large complications of coordinated or synchronous activity in order for them to like meaningfully communicate and pass messages. This is sometimes called communication through coherence. But that if you excite the neurons too much, they don't need to come into agreement. They can fire more independently. They fall out of sync with each other, and so your normal coordinated activity actually kind of becomes less coordinated, more entropic, flatter. And so the idea is you're relaxing your usual assumptions, your usual beliefs. And so in addition to this idea of like plasticity, windows opening on this like mechanistic level of like neurons wiring themselves up, there might be a kind of like immediate plasticity that happens where your normal assumptions are relaxed.
And the benefit of them being relaxed when it comes to things like potentially depression is effectively that the depression was in some way the result of these assumptions. And I use the word assumptions sort of vaguely. And as soon as you change those assumptions, oh my God, you might see results that you haven't seen in other areas. Where is the caution then?
I mean,
Yeah, because that all sounds like good news, right? It sounds like, well, look, you've got sort of stuck patterns. You want to like unstick them. You can either go through years of therapy or you can do this in a meditative training program. But you could also just, take a pill or take a hit and then the brain heats up and these things break down, and then it cools down and you're kind of better. But that can't be the whole story, I think, right? Otherwise that everybody should be sort of doing this. Maybe
There's-
everybody should be doing this. I'm not
I
sure.
mean, there are schools of thought, and I don't think they're completely without merit, that actually think that's a good part of the story. That actually there is something kind of univalenced about the psychedelic experience, where there is a kind of like, blast them to the moon, let the natural healer take over.
Just burn. You know what? The house is no good. Let's burn the house down.
Yeah.
And then you can grow something new. Yeah, I hear that.
And I don't think that's 100% without merit, that basically a lot of people might benefit from basically having their assumptions shaken up and
Yeah.
having kind of like limited experience of sorts, and that maybe if this experience involves things like a kind of forced surrender or deep acceptance, including with respect to things that were hard to face, that actually could like, it could be like, if that does seem to be a somewhat reliable thing that happens with higher doses. And so if you could control that, this would be basically in a way like the Hopkins model of psychedelic psychotherapy, which is you shoot them into space under minimal basic supportive conditions in case something goes wrong, but it's largely self-directed. That being said, it's not the whole story. And I think some of the risks, one set of risks I think would be told just at the level of what we were just describing in terms of like this relaxation of beliefs, and another also in terms of potentially strengthened beliefs. And so it seems that there probably isn't one story of psychedelics, just like there's not one story of meditation. What is the practice? What is the substance? What is the dose? What is the set? What is the setting? Could be very different regimes that are brought forth. And so how many different psychedelic accounts do we need, even if across all of them there's general principles, very similar, I'd say, to meditation, and continuous with it, as I know you're sympathetic to and I'm putting forward. But the dangers, let's say we're just talking about relaxed beliefs. Well, some of these beliefs you're relaxing, you could think of maybe as a kind of like epistemic hygiene. Like those beliefs were there for a reason.
Yeah.
Some of the reason they could be there is just they were good to be good at being there. It was like malware, and like you just maybe it's great that it gets uninstalled, but some of it ain't malware. Some of it's like the OS. And so who knows what could come in under those like destabilized conditions? Like a paradigm shift it's a promising thing, but it's a perilous thing too. Like it's just not guaranteed that what you shift to, it could be a deepening of what came before, potentially the pathological elements.
Yeah.
It could be something completely different that's beneficial or harmful. The one thing I was mentioning in terms of strengthened beliefs is you could potentially get this both within the Rebus model, and also I think in some of what I've been suggesting is that you might get, so within Rebus, the way you can get a strengthened belief is if you think of predictive processing as this a potentially large hierarchy, and maybe within this hierarchy of predictions that you're making of what you expect to be in the world, and where your mind is this predictive engine, that there could be qualitatively different types of predictions happening along this hierarchy, and you can get kind of paradoxical effects where, like, if you relax beliefs higher up, that can cause like a disinhibition of beliefs lower down. So it's possible that like your deep beliefs being relaxed about what you expect to be in the world, maybe with some of your assumptions aside, just the immediate perceptual vividness of what's going on, whether it's in perception or imagination, that could get strengthened, like indirectly. And so that's a way, like a Rebus account, like if you think of a complex hierarchy of beliefs, like you can get strengthening too. I know this is going a little in the weeds, but I think the weeds might end up being important for navigating the years to come. And so the other thing I was mentioning is you could potentially get a direct strengthening. And so one thing I've been focusing on is that it's not clear to me that you would always get this sort of desynchronization from psychedelics. So psychedelics, they seem to largely act on this class of receptors called 5-HT2A. And so serotonin has, like, depending on how you count, about 14 classes of receptors. The one that might be particularly important would be this 2A class. And so what they will do is they will increase the gain or the excitability of the parts of the brain. These they're called deep pyramidal neurons. They'll loop with the thalamus and they'll form these big synchronous complexes that we were talking about earlier in terms of these potentially would encode your beliefs. But it's not clear that any increasing of gain on those units that shoot for distance and synchronize should cause them to desynchronize. It might be the case that, like, as you increase the stimulation, you're actually increasing their ability to recruit themselves into these like coalitions of mutually active neurons, and this would be a strengthened belief. And so,
So when that comes to well-being, is there anything to say there about the strengthening of the beliefs? I mean, is that necessarily a bad thing or necessarily a good thing, or it could be either depending on what beliefs are being strengthened? So we have this sort of model where psychedelics look like they loosen our belief network, and that seems all good. But you're saying maybe this is overly simplified. In some ways, it might strengthen other beliefs. Is there anything to say about that strengthening with regards to well-being, or maybe it's a wash?
uh, it's not at all clear to me. At this point, like I don't know when we should say like on average, it's a wash or it's a net
Yeah,
positive or a net negative.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
it might be there's types of people if you could identify them on average, and I think we're not that far from it. We have some intuitions about it. Like there's some types of people we'd say, yeah, that's likely to be a net negative, net positive, and there's some types of people where we would say, yeah, probably not you. And so like in general, like for instance, people with a family history of things like psychotic conditions, like they tend to be screened out. The idea being like if your beliefs are already a little too compelling to you, and that you might be prone to psychotic tendencies, anything that could radically destabilize your belief landscape, whether we're talking relaxing or strengthening, that could be dangerous.
Right.
So it seems like when it's beneficial, it comes back to this idea of the set and the setting. It's going to be very much like what was the experience that they had, whether it was self-directed or you helped to guide them through. What was the integration like, and what were those pre-existing tendencies, and what are the new patterns? So, for instance, uh, uh, Chris Letheby and Christopher Timmerman, they have some interesting work showing that, for instance, like your metaphysical beliefs could change. And so some people are coming out of these particularly group psychedelic sessions, talking about greater beliefs in fatalism, thinking that basically consciousness is more continuous with nature, more of an openness to things like you might say non-naturalism, or like things like a supernatural world of sorts being likely. And I'm not saying these are bad things, but like these are major modifications if you were to your mind if you weren't thinking this before.
Yep.
And these
Yep.
do
I hear
seem to
that.
move on. And so it could be, for instance, so positive, you might discover greater nature connectedness because you find like you're with this new relaxed state where you've let go of some of your things, you just discover the beauty of nature, or you might have like a strength thing where like there you are and you're feeling some natural beauty, and you know it, but then like you're able to go into it even more, get like an absorption state going from the activating abilities of these compounds, and that could be great. So now you have like greater nature connectedness, this source of resiliency, and maybe an ethics even, or
So,
you could develop like a conspiracy theory could take hold, and then you're off to the races with that. So
so
it really
just
depends.
yeah, exactly. Right along those lines, then, it seems, I don't know, it sort of seems obvious that if you're going to heat the brain up chemically, then maybe you should have a supporting practice also for helping to install good beliefs, wholesome approaches to life. I mean, maybe that's what's missing. I mean, I guess it's not missing from a lot of the traditional approaches to using psychedelics because that was really set within a spiritual framework of some sort. But I mean, today's sort of like tourist approach, you fly down to South America, take ayahuasca, come home, have no supporting practice. Maybe there's a benefit here with regards to what you're saying about not only heating the brain up, but getting the right beliefs then in, things like, compassion or loving kindness or different ways of seeing the world in a wise way.
I mean, absolutely. Like, I think there's a sense in which, like, I don't want to, like, not do justice to the field. Like, there are people, already in their practice, they put a lot of care into the preparation, a lot of care into the integration. and it's like well integrated. The integration process is well integrated into a broader like clinical practice set of interventions. Like so,
Yeah.
you might be doing like a lot of like acceptance and commitment therapy or internal
Right.
family systems. Or different like types of work might be done with the person to hope for this kind of like synergy.
Yeah.
But uh, that's very incomplete, and it's some people are hoping it's just going to be like a standard medical model where it's like a med check and it's just like Prozac 2.0. Some people are thinking maybe even like um, the psychological effects of the psychedelics might have nothing to do with the therapeutic efficacy. This is a perspective where it might just be like the plastogen elements, where it's just like happening at this like low physiological level. And so some people are trying to create psychedelics without like psychedelic psychological effects, but that can.
Right.
I'm a little skeptical of these approaches. I don't think they're without merit, but anyways, the uh, it seems that this there is. It seems like a lot of the good was done with contemplative science with like the MBSR type model, which is you try to like really strip it down and then you make it more widely available. And so maybe something like that could happen with psychedelics. But
But
you know,
keep going.
but these are powerful medicines, and
Yeah.
so in
Right.
that process, you could end up putting people at risk by removing certain supportive structures, like
Yeah.
the holding context you were just mentioning.
Right. Right.
It feels as if, in some ways, like what you're doing when we're talking about well-being and psychedelics, is in some ways rolling the dice. Like as you say, there's a certain you might be the type of person, and there might be more information that comes out around this, such that it can be designed like a Prozac. But it sounds like the shoot to the moon and let the thing recover. Sounds brilliant under the assumption that, well, it recovers and there's a natural recoverer, but sounds less appealing in some ways when you go, well, look, it could strengthen some beliefs. We've all had people sort of in our lives, communities, our networks, who have had bad experiences. And I guess the question that merges is, do you see this as a future staple of well-being, or do you think there's just so much uncertainty that's inherent to it that isn't a matter of lack of information, that it'll always end up being slightly ambitious or risky?
That is like the key question. Like, is this psychedelic renaissance like is it like a revolution or a slow motion train wreck? Um, uh,
That's awesome.
the answer might be yes. Um, but in terms of like you just said, like staple of well being, and that's a I don't know, and I don't think we can rule it out, and I don't think we can be assured. I think if, for instance, though, the best practices of contemplative science are applied, and if a lot of the insights from contemplative science and actually contemplative practice are combined with psychedelic interventions, then maybe it should be a staple. But in the current kind of roll the dice setup, even though there are some things that make the dice loaded to be more positive outcomes, like screening out people with potential risk factors, although that itself, like those might be the people who need it the most, right?
Yeah.
But um, I think that's something to aspire to, and that is possible, but will only actually be realizable if there is some sort of, this is a personal opinion, integration with contemplative practice and the best practices of contemplative practice.
So
Then
that's that's sort of a good segue too. So, given your research,
a lot of people disagree with that.
well,
Like,
that's okay. But if we think about just contemplative training by itself, and maybe we can come back to sort of contemplative training plus psychedelics, but just contemplative training itself, is it doing similar things? Can we see similar sort of mechanisms in play just in contemplative practice? Because if we can, then there might be, I don't know, there's something to be said for contemplative training can be done in a slower, more progressive, more skill-based way. Like you're not just getting shot to the moon, rather you're developing skills and abilities. You're letting states become traits slowly over time. But maybe there's something, maybe there's something crucially different going on between psychedelics and different kinds of contemplative training where, one would be incomplete without the other.
there seems to be huge overlap, but there are also distinct things that you just mentioned, like the gradualness, the controllability, and maybe though the controllability potentially for better and worse. Like kind of like so there's within like uh, psychedelic psychotherapeutic thought, like some people, for instance, would try to prepare the person more so that their entry is more in choice, is more um, uh, feels good to them, and so that the whole experience might be smooth and copacetic and like puts them in a state of maybe some of the aspects of the mystic experience, like this deep positivity and like openness to the world, with the goal being like ease them in. Um, but there's other schools of thought which are like, and this is kind of, I'm not saying that the blast them to the moon model is
Yep.
this, but there's other
Yep.
schools of thought which is like go for forced surrender, go for an experience that's so overwhelming that you have no choice but to let go, and and there does seem to be a kind of a semi-paradoxical thing where higher doses might actually be more univalenced in some ways. When it goes bad, it might really, really go bad. But there seems to be like this middle regime where you might try to control things more, and that's where things might start to go south or sideways, which is like where you're kind of bringing this like controlling impulse to something that's hard to control with a lot of stuff coming up that you might not have been looking at.
Yeah.
Some of it might be real stuff, some of it might be just a delusion, but you don't know. And so, and that could be like the seeds of the bad trip actually might be more likely and a potentially traumatizing trip, where that trauma might itself be an opportunity for growth, but that might be actually potentially more likely uh, at the somewhat like less extreme doses. Anyways, but the with meditation and the similarities, I don't think we've done enough work to really nail this down, but there are in both cases uh, increased brain complexity measures, increased entropy has been associated with both. Um, you do see this common reduction in some of the slower rhythms of the brain, like alpha, some reduction in beta from the particular, I think, the posterior cortices, and this is basically has been correlated with things like senses of uh, ego transcendence, like an egoless experience, both in the context of meditation and psychedelics. And so Judd Brewer, so like Robin Carhart Harris, he probably, I think he did most of the documenting this with respect to psychedelics, this reduction in posterior alpha, um, and Brewer did it with meditation. And Chris Timmerman is doing some really good work describing this in like details of like these computational models of predictive processing. Um, and so there's also some other things, like for instance, like another way you might, for instance, potentially interpret like increased gamma associated with some meditative states. You could think of that actually as more when you relax your belief, your prior beliefs, your expectations, more novel information can make it in, and that's thought to be encoded potentially gamma frequencies, like the novel information that updates you. And so
So
that
you're not filtering out things
yeah,
anymore because you don't know what's going on. So you're more sensitive to new information to come in.
and so maybe that's a commonality in meditation, going like more naive bays, or just more like
Right?
relaxed.
Beginner's mind in a way, right? You're
And
open to insight because you're not stuck in one way of seeing the world. So you're open to see it in a new sort of exciting way.
so there's these, yes, and so those are like that seems to be common, and maybe like a core powerful potential for change in both psychedelics and contemplative practice. But as you're also saying, though, there's some key differences, like the gradualness, the controllability of the process, the being able, and with that gradualness, being able to integrate it more into things like a supportive community, a value system,
Yeah.
like as opposed to trying to compress everything with this like, you know, strapping rockets to your back and going down the mountain,
It's so interesting, we're finding the exact same, I find the exact same split between camps in the meditation, in some of the Buddhist meditation communities also. You get a sort of sense that some people think just jumping right into insight practices and selfless generating practices and emptiness practices is the way to go, like just sort of shooting for the moon without any of the support structure in play. And you have other people saying, no, you need to have really rich, developed senses of being in a field of love and care. You need to really sort of purify the heart, be in a good, wholesome place before you start jeopardizing your belief networks by looking closely at the sort of cracks between what you take yourself to be and what the world is like. And I've just got to say, like, I turned 42 this year. I've been practicing for a couple of decades. And at the end of being a pretty extreme practitioner, it makes me feel so wobbly in myself to think about this. Just shoot for it, just break it up, hope for the best. I just think like, oh my goodness, don't do that at all. Start with love. Start with love. Get into a place where you feel really safe being a human, and then slowly, methodically, and with like lots of support, start poking holes in your like potential beliefs about who you are.
I mean, but that, like what you just said, start with love. Like, I actually wonder whether, like, if we could, like, somehow, like, blast this to, like, every psychedelic researcher and make that their focus, like, would that be the difference between the
Right.
revolution and the train wreck? Like,
Right,
if
like eight,
that
eight,
message
eight
just said,
solid weeks or 3 months of like really deep abiding in care fields, doing loving kindness, doing compassion training, getting those things up and strong, and then I mean, lots of traditions, Buddhist traditions, talk about using that as a container, and then growing your insight training within that container.
and then maybe it could be a staple. And then maybe it ought to be a staple. But I think without that, it very much is that's a risky thing to have as a staple in the medicine cabinet.
Yeah.
I want to move it just for a second to something that people often think about when we think about psychedelics, which is creativity. People describe themselves as being more creative. You get people tell you microdosing being a source of creativity. Why? I mean, number one, is there any evidence that psychedelics do aid creativity? And if so, why?
Um, I think there's a decent and messy evidence base on psychedelics. Well, messy with respect to almost everything. I think you could say that for the evidence base for most things with psychedelics, but the creativity literature is one of them, I think, more well developed in some ways because that is an intuition a lot of people had, and I think they had it for a reason. And it seems like, well, some of the, like, to the degree there is some mess there. It seems part of it might be distinguishing between more convergent and divergent forms of creativity. And it seems like this could potentially vary with the type of psychedelic intervention you're doing. So, divergent creativity, like having more novelty about it, more exploration, but you might not be coming up with anything particularly useful for any given purpose that you can see. It might be useful down the line. It might be like the most useful thing eventually, but in the moment you're trying to solve a particular problem, divergent creativity is not what you want. Convergent creativity, though, would be the thing where it's like, okay, I'm like a new, like one of those clever crows, and if I take the hook and I bend it like this, it's like boom, nailed it. Like, so whether that's positively impacted by psychedelics, um, very very unclear. Probably not, and maybe especially not for things like the bigger doses. Maybe there's some cases where for smaller doses you might get an effect, but is it above and beyond what you would get from, let's say, an active placebo? Like I gave you a caffeine pill, not clear that you're getting better conversion creativity effects. But why might it help though? So I think, you know, for anything basically in medicine, and maybe all of the human condition might be just like uh, self-fulfilling prophecies and expectation. Like it, like kind of like Dumbo's magic feather. Like if you think you can, then you like live into it and you set up like a learning curriculum for yourself, and you can become more creative just from having the assumption I am more creative now. Like that can help, but it could also be like you think you're more creative, and then like you might be less evaluative and you might be hurting along some dimensions of the, it's both like this proposing a lot of different things, and then it's like a two-step process of you have like the novel forms, kind of like evolution, and then you select the good ones. And so if you just like, and so the selection part, the discernment of picking out the right forms, that's going to be an important part also. And that doesn't seem to be particularly helped by the larger doses, but coming up with the initial like broader repertoire of things you wouldn't have considered otherwise seems to be there across the board, and also though dependent on your expectancy of, will I be more creative? Do I feel brave enough to try the different thing? Am I giving myself the license to try to see something different? And there could be a direct story to be told along the lines of things like rebus or cebus effects, where it's like things are manifesting that wouldn't bubble up otherwise, and so that's the source of creativity. Or with a, like, if you do have like an elevated like arousal or consciousness level, you might be a little bit more like on point and be able to do more like creative synthesis that way. Or if you're getting this sort of like relaxation of your beliefs and you're put into this like radically different brain regime doing different things, that's going to be a source of creativity there too. So anyway, promising, messy, nothing. I have not yet encountered the like, I wish there was just a simple story of like big doses are doing this, small doses are doing that, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems really variable and maybe like really dependent on the individual.
Yeah, I think that's a fair reflection of the whole state of affairs across the well-being, creativity, etc. I want to just move this for a moment to free will. You've written about psychedelics and free will, which isn't a combination I'd ever considered before. Why is psychedelics or psychedelic experiences interesting in the context of free will?
Um, Interestingly, if you actually like look at that recent like metaphysical beliefs study, psychedelics tend to, at least in the context of community practice, tend to push people in a more fatalistic direction. That's not necessarily incompatible with free will. Like you can, for instance, be a determinist and you believe your agency is a meaningful thing at the same time. You could hold both those beliefs. I think most philosophers do. But there is a tension there. And so I guess in terms of the connections to free will, I'm wondering about both using psychedelics as a probe to better understand the mechanisms of free will. Also wondering whether the context of agency might explain some of the story of the mechanisms involved and why they were selected in evolution. And also kind of, I don't want to say pragmatically, clinically, there's an idea with psychedelics that the frames we have become self-fulfilling prophecies. And so, and different frames might have different utilities. And there might be like a difficulty, like the desire to even separate like psychedelics from like something like placebo responding in some ways might be wrong-headed. And then in some ways psychedelics could be like amplifying your expectation and you actually want to leverage it and harness it. So try to bring that together. With free will, it seems that there is a tension in that people want both the free part and the willing part. And they exist in a kind of state of dynamic tension. And like the language seems to be a little bit wise in my opinion, where it's like you want the agency, you want to be able to get the things you want, but you also do want the more like libertarian type free will of like being a little bit of an uncaused cause. Like you want to be able to draw a wild card, break free of the past. I think we associate this with like the ability to pivot. I mean, I myself, like as the years go on, habit just feels more and more oppressive. And so like I become my own imprisoner. And so like this idea of like both being really valuable to being like a meaningful agent in the world, like we want the freedom and we want the will together, that seems about right. And so with psychedelics, there seems to be, so if you're in predictive processing, part of the means by which you would bring about a desired outcome is via the strength of that prediction. Like how consistently do you hold it? And then that becomes the equilibrium point or the attracting state that the system like organizes around to bring that about as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So like I'm consistently imagining the thing I'm about to do later today, and that's the thing that's actually directing me. I'm to do the things to make that thing come to pass. So if psychedelics can enhance your ability to imagine things, then this, in theory, could be an intention amplifier. And so, in theory, this could be a free will amplifier. And I actually wonder if the 5-HT2A system, most of its selection might have been less well understood in terms of like relaxing your beliefs and becoming more open to things. I think that's crucially important, but actually most of the selection might have been almost at the level of enhancing willing and agency. And so the 5-HT2A system seems to have evolved around the time, about 500 million years ago, around the time of the Cambrian explosion with the evolution of jawed fishes. And so I'll try to bring this home, but this to me implies some sort of involvement in like predator-prey arms races. Like if you have jaws, you can swim after something and bite it. And so now you have an incentive to have that strongly directed intention to get your bite and get it at the right place. And you have a strong incentive to get the hell away from that thing that's trying to bite you. And so the idea that basically initially 5-HT2A could be a strengthening of predictions to support a kind of overclocking for more strong goal pursuit. And so this would be like, I'm actually wondering whether that's much of it. And if you see some of the things that will agonize or stimulate those receptors, like carbon dioxide, for instance, when those levels go up, there's a connection there like breath work, but that will, for instance, activate these psychedelic pathways, not necessarily to a psychedelic level, but they seem to be activated by like carbon dioxide. And so like, let's say like you're moving really hard, pursuing a goal, and you're breathing heavily, that's actually going to activate your 5-HT2A system, and I think that'll be consistent. Yeah, but there does seem to be, so in this way, I think there's a connection of this system as agency enhancing, and then so that way free will enhancing. But in terms of like the freedom part, we might want a little bit more of like a rebus type story. Although I think you could tell it in a strengthened belief domain if, like, for instance, what you're doing then with that enhanced agency, like these things all become complicated in ways that I have not wrapped my head around in terms of like if you like for instance, I can think of myself as being a more open person. And if I believe that, I can then become more open, even though I'm like kind of dogmatically like holding on to this belief that I am more open. Anyways, but in terms of the free part and rebus, this idea though of exploring a radically different way of being than the one that your agency would normally explore, and doing so in a state that's deeply experienced and where your plasticity is through the roof, that this then would be expanding your capacity to change and break free of the past. In a more like wild card kind of way. So one's like a little, so I think there's like these different accounts that relate to the different aspects of free will and what we're looking for in this kind of dynamic tension we seem to have in mind that seems to be almost reflected in these different regimes, each of which might have been selected in different ways over the course of evolution. In terms of a story we're just now figuring out. And one more quick thing about like the relaxation. So I've actually been wondering whether the psychedelic level of stimulation of those pathways might usually only occur under maybe involving the endogenous DMT system, and maybe occurring in the context of mating and reproduction. That actually most of the selection was like the opposite of what people are thinking of now in terms of like this greater openness to things, and that from Rebus, that this was a part of it, but actually most of it was you being more of like a directed agent, was most of it. There's a challenge, and Cebus, rather, it's a challenge in that these psychedelic pathways are actually trying to get you to double down on your predictions and become a little more imaginative and push harder. But that there's a certain point where they're not doing that, and I'm wondering whether most of the evolution for that was actually, this is how you pair bond, and this is how parents bond with their children, and so what you're relaxing is your core sense of self to open up yourself to someone else.
It's amazing. Right. I'm just starting to catch it now. Right.
Yeah.
Like,
We don't know, but that's what I'm wondering.
I love talking with you, Adam. It's such a delight to talk about your research, because this is not an easy, simple topic, right? It's a complex topic. And I love to hear, I like every story where sort of both ends of the scale look like they come into play. One is you have a greater amount of flexibility that's being generated, but we have also this evidence that these circuits are also for directed behaviors. So you have a sort of balancing between opening and direction. And I was sort of wondering there, I was just waiting to jump in and be like, I don't really get why that would be beneficial for mating or like these sorts of attractions, but you're right. I see, like, you could be directed towards a partner, towards your children, and the openness is to sort of include them by giving up your own self-centeredness in a way so that you're able to include more maybe in your empathic circle. Wow, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating research line.
I wonder if that was initial selection, and then one more thing would be, I wonder Um, is this actually part of the story of uniquely human cooperativity that helped us to jumpstart cumulative culture? Did you have these like pathways set up for like initially selected for these other contexts, but then later it became kind of like a hive mind switch, where basically maybe you could get some fairly rapid evolution of these pathways that are involved in psychedelics as part of the evolution of human cognitive modernity, where the cognitive modernity is of a socio emotional variety of our ability to learn from each other and be open to each other. And that might potentially, I'm not saying, like the stoned ape hypothesis, where it's like we ate mushrooms and fell into symbiosis, but that these pathways might be involved. I think there's increasing openness to this idea that this could be a major, like, if you have this powerful system that's creating such drastic effects, maybe this is a major lever of change, and maybe these levers were pulled on at some point, and maybe this is part of why we're such strange apes. Maybe.
It's really interesting to hear the historical, sociological story for the inclusion of psychedelics and to find out sort of what role they might have played socially. Because it's not something that you tend to catch when you're normally talking about psychedelics. Adam, is there a practical takeaway for listeners, given your
Nice.
research and given your practice?
Yeah.
In light of all like the dangers that that can happen, and Mark was mentioning, like, I'm actually kind of grateful that I'm a really terrible meditator. I try. I'm just not very good at it, but I keep trying. And so I'm not so. It's really for practice. The only thing I advise people is like uh, ask less, get more. Sometimes, at least in the beginning.
Nice.
But in terms of like practical takeaways for psychedelics, it's still very much a wild west, and it seems like the classic advice of like deep attending to the set and the setting, like what are the conditions you're bringing up, and thinking, what is the entry going to be like, and what is the re-entry into the world going to be like for the experience, and there's a window that's opening potentially, and so what is your intention? What do you want to integrate? So there's a plasticity window. That's a promising and a perilous thing. What do you want? And then having that like worked out maybe beforehand. And so there could be a case where, you don't necessarily need to do that if you don't have like a family history of mental illness. You're just trying to like, you're doing it as a kind of psychonaut exploration, like what's there. And that's a way to do it. And if you don't have a lot of risk factors, that might be just fine. But you know, some of us have greater tendencies towards dark night of the soul type things, and I'm probably one of them. And uh, a little more care would be needed, and to take the time to make sure the environment is supportive, to make sure you have a plan for getting additional support if you need it. Things like that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a brilliant way to frame the practical question within what is a Wild West. It's hard to give advice to the Wild West because it's wild.
Yeah, it's a bunch of cats just running around
It's
doing
what we
cat.
mean by it's what we mean by wild, right? Hard to know.
Adam, where can everybody find you?
Somewhere on the internet usually. Let's say Twitter is a good way to reach me. Sometimes I've been known to use Facebook as a science blog, although I haven't been keeping up with that recently. And sometimes I'll post a conversation to YouTube. So,
Um, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, thank you for listening. That was Adam Saffron, and this has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. And as always, we will see you next week.